On a humid night in Milwaukee, a terrified man ran into the street with handcuffs hanging from one wrist. He stopped two police officers and begged for help. Minutes later, inside apartment 213, officers opened a drawer and found Polaroid photographs that exposed a nightmare hidden in plain sight. The man who lived there seemed quiet, awkward, and easy to overlook. But behind that apartment door was Jeffrey Dahmer. This is Crime Unmasked, where we uncover the darkest true crime stories from around the world, the cases that shocked nations, baffled investigators, and still haunt people today. This episode is told to remember the victims and to examine how a killer hid in plain sight, not to glorify the man who committed these crimes. Jeffrey Dahmer was born in Milwaukee in 1960, but much of his youth unfolded in Ohio. By his own later accounts, he became withdrawn early, struggled socially, and carried disturbing fantasies long before police ever knew his name. In 1978, shortly after graduating high school, he committed his first known murder, 18-year-old Stephen Hicks. Then, for years, there was what looked like silence. But silence did not mean safety. Years after that first killing, Dahmer resumed murdering young men and boys. Investigators later learned that he targeted vulnerable people, often luring them with money, alcohol, or promises of photographs. In total, he confessed to 17 killings between 1978 and 1991. Many victims were young men from marginalized communities, and their disappearances did not always receive the urgency they deserved. That matters, because this story is not only about a killer. It is also about whose lives were treated as urgent and whose pain was overlooked. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, Dahmer was living at the Oxford Apartments in Milwaukee. Apartment 213 became the center of the horror. Behind an ordinary door, he photographed victims and concealed human remains. Neighbors later described foul smells and strange noises, yet the full truth remained hidden. That is one of the most disturbing parts of this case. The crimes were happening in a shared building while daily life continued right outside. The Jeffrey Dahmer case still haunts people not only because of what he did, but because of the moments when intervention might have been possible. He had prior arrests, including a conviction connected to the sexual assault of a teenage boy. There were complaints, unsettling encounters, and opportunities to look closer. One of the most painful failures involved 14-year-old Konorak Synthesumphone. After escaping Dahmer in 1991, he was encountered by police and then returned to the apartment. He was murdered soon after. That moment became one of the darkest symbols of this entire case. On July 22, 1991, everything changed. A man named Tracy Edwards escaped Dahmer's apartment with one hand still cuffed and found police in the street. He led officers back to apartment 213. Inside, one officer found Polaroid photographs showing bodies in stages of dismemberment. Suspicion became certainty in seconds. Dahmer was arrested that night, and police found human remains in the apartment. This was not rumor, and not an urban legend. Milwaukee had been living beside a serial killer for years. After his arrest, Dahmer confessed to a total of 17 killings. The details stunned the nation, not only because of the scale of the crimes, but because of the unbearable question underneath them: how had this gone on for so long? In 1992, he was found legally sane and sentenced to multiple life terms in prison. Yet for the families, there was no clean ending. Only grief, anger, and the lasting pain of knowing their loved ones had been failed more than once. Jeffrey Dahmer was killed in prison in 1994 by fellow inmate Christopher Scarver. But his death did not close the chapter. The case continued to haunt Milwaukee and the wider public because it represented more than one man's crimes. It exposed blind spots, social, institutional, and human. People remember the horror, but they should also remember the pattern, the ignored voices, the missed chances, and the lives that should have mattered sooner. Jeffrey Dahmer became known as the Milwaukee Cannibal. But the most terrifying part of this story may be how ordinary he appeared before the truth was uncovered. And if this case proved that evil can hide in plain sight, the next one may be even more disturbing, because the killer may have taunted investigators directly for years. Subscribe to Crime Unmasked, and step back into the shadows with our next case, the Zodiac Killer.